All right, perfect. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Steve, for inviting me out. If you were to look on the sort of caricature board out front, I would be the one with the heading A, because I am, in fact, the only Canadian here. Yeah, exactly. Now, as I go through this presentation, you may also find some things that maybe don't look like they're spelled correctly. Where I come from, they're spelled correctly. So we could have a healthy debate about that later on today if you want to. So I work for a company called Viqua. Viqua is a manufacturer of ultraviolet disinfection. And we mainly focus on point of entry, point of use, physical disinfection. So we'll start today. I just want to go through a bit of an overview of why continuous disinfection is important and where it sort of fits in the grander scheme of private wells. It's a little bit of a taboo topic, and I think disinfection mechanisms get a little bit of a bad rap because I think people use them as clutches to avoid things that they necessarily should be doing, just as the part of good sort of well stewardship. So the way that I see continuous disinfection as an asset, obviously, to the private well community is, in addition to the necessary things that we need to do day in, or I shouldn't say day in, but annually, let's say, to protect the environment, to protect our source waters, because that's really, at the end of the day, what we really need to invest our energy in. We can't ignore the facts that groundwater sources are becoming contaminated, so we need to make sure that we have the necessary processes in place as an industry to deal with that. But we also need to recognize that at the end of the day, that will take you so far. And when we think about microbial contamination in water, we're really looking at risks. We're not living in a world of absolutes. So I think having good source water protection plans is probably the most critical thing that exists, making sure that you have very robust maintenance schedules around well security, around the integrity of septic systems, because at the end of the day, a lot of those are at the core of why we're seeing microbial indicators in water. Which goes to the next point that is incredibly important is source water monitoring. And that is probably one of the most overlooked things I find in my own experience in the private well industry is people just simply don't test their water. It's an out of sight, out of mind conversation, but it's so incredibly important for us to understand the health of that system, right? The health of that well and what risks really exist for potential pathogens to be present. So those things are super, super important. And I think continuous disinfection, and in my world, the form of UV, I'm saying continuous disinfection because I'm an advocate for disinfection as a whole. If you're a chlorination person, good on you. Again, we can have a healthy debate about that later, but continuous disinfection is beneficial because it helps bridge the gap between those processes. Those processes are snapshots in time, and they're generally done on annual basis. So we'll generally have well inspections annually. We'll have septic inspections annually. We will do source monitoring annually or 2 times a year. More frequently, the better, obviously. And continuous disinfection is something that bridges that gap. Its intention is not to take away from any of these other things that are important. And I think that's where it kind of gets a bad rap, because people say, well, I'm just going to put in this disinfection system, then I don't need to worry about my well. I don't need to worry about testing my water. I don't need to worry about well construction or septic integrity. I'm just going to ignore those things, and that's not fair. That's not what we should be doing. So continuous disinfection is part of a good strategy for dealing with potential pathogens in water. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the objective there is to protect human health, right? To reduce the instances of AGI or gastrointestinal illness. So going beyond a basic sort of ground source or private source strategy, continuous disinfection falls very, very neatly into our overall home water treatment strategy. So we need to look at potential pathogens. We need to look at things like that and what UV or disinfection technologies are there to deal with beyond just the source. And this little swim lane that I've provided is very Canadian. I don't know in your region if you look at things the same way, but in Canada, for home water or private wells, we function off something called the Guidelines for Canadian Water Quality. And our guidelines for Canadian water quality cover 3 areas, really. They cover physical and chemical parameters, they cover radioactive parameters, and they cover microbiological parameters. And for me, as both a manufacturer and as a water treatment professional, I consider this to be the most sound design guideline, really, that exists. Because it forces us to follow a path that's already been set forth in my world by our federal government. This is what will make water safe. And it is truly a risk-based approach. So UV fits very, very neatly into the microbiological contamination side of things. But that in itself as a strategy has a lot of variables that exist in it as well. So even though we're looking at source water quality and we're determining whether these are high risk or low risk sources, are they of fair integrity, all the different treatment technologies that we put in, they also layer into that as well. So UV or disinfection is a perfect safeguard at the end of this, in some instances, complicated distribution system, to just make sure that we have something in place that will prevent pathogen growth or pathogens entering the system and getting someone sick. So, and this is just an example of what I'm trying to explain. When we go through a treatment process, when we go through treatment design, we're considering all these things and what they're doing. Filtration, backwashing filters, carbon filters, all these have risks of potentially growing microorganisms and potentially introducing or having pathogens sort of within them and releasing those into the home. So final stage of continuous disinfection is just a really, really, really safe approach for us to take as a water treatment industry. So that little blurb is behind us. We'll focus specifically on technology overview. So I'm going to talk about UV specifically at this point. We're going to look at UV at a very high level about how that process sort of works and how we implement that. We're going to look at sort of some negatives, I guess, to the technology and applying it and how it's misapplied. And at the end of it, I left lots of time for us to ask questions because I know it's a topic that definitely generates a lot of them as we go. So UV is part of our electromagnetic spectrum. So it's an invisible wavelength of light that at a certain wavelength, UVC is germicidal. So microorganisms are able to sort of get absorbed by that, and they disrupt a part of their DNA, which stops them from reproducing. There's a fairly broad spectrum of light that is in fact germicidal, but as an industry, we focus on an optimal sort of range, and that is 254 nanometers. What we're seeing in advancements in UV technology, specifically as we go down the path of UVC LED, which is an alternative to mercury vapor, is we're seeing standards being developed or things are changing in which we're figuring out how we can use different wavelengths of light to achieve more efficient disinfection processes. But at the end of the day, right now, mercury vapor is really how we do it, and we generate light most specifically around 254 nanometers. So as I say, as that UV energy penetrates the cell wall, we alter a portion of that DNA. And what's really happening is that organism, although still alive, can't reproduce. And that basically, at the end of the day, is what we worry about from an infectious side of things, is if that organism can sort of find a host and it can replicate, that's where we get infection and that's where we get illness. So the organisms eventually will die, but when they leave a UV reactor, they are still very much alive. And there's some areas of research there that bring some of that into question, in which organisms are introduced to sunlight for longer periods of time, and there's some regenerative process that exists there. But as far as private wells and sort of basic water treatment in that sense, it's not really a huge risk in my mind. So how our disinfection process sort of works, or how we determine whether we're going to be able to achieve the inactivation of these organisms, is a little bit more complicated than I care to admit, but it really boils down to the target organism that you're going after. There's a lot of different microorganisms that exist in the world. There's a ton of pathogens that exist in the world, and try to determine what we're going after can be very, very tough. And I've provided some examples of those organisms below, ranging from 10 millijoules to 186 millijoules. And those are units of measurement as far as UV energy is concerned, to tell us, with this much UV energy, what sort of level of inactivation are we going to see? So UV dose, in its most basic sense, is a calculation of intensity and time. So really, how bright is your ultraviolet light, and how long did a microorganism really sit in front of that light? And that's going to determine how well, or to what degree, we're going to be able to inactivate it. And we measure the performance of a UV reactor. We measure that sort of viability in log reduction, which is a fairly basic principle of, well, this many went in, how many went out. And so we had, 1 million culturable organisms came in one side. When they left, how many were still culturable on the other side? And we do that through challenge testing, which is really, really important with UV reactors, and I'll touch a bit more on that a little bit later. But we need to know our target organism. We need to know its dose response, how many millijoules it takes to get various log reductions, and then we challenge our own reactor against that. So we say, MS2 really, as an example, is about 20 millijoules per log reduction. We put MS2 in, we see what comes out the other side, and we're able to correlate a dose to that. We can then apply that dose to various targets that exist in the environment, and we can ultimately say, if you have adenovirus in your water, we're going to need this much UV dose to get it 1, 2, 3, 4 log inactivation, and it's really a sizing and design situation at that point. There are some various standards that exist in the world around just blanket UV doses. I have a hard time having an opinion on them, simply because it's just far more complicated, I feel, than this. But as an industry in the residential private well world, most UV manufacturers are targeting around a 30 millijoule dose, which provides a fairly significant blanket for common pathogens we find in the water, and a 4 log reduction of those pathogens. If you go down a path of sort of speciating really what's in the water, you might find from a design side that you're choosing something different. And then NSF has standard 55 Class A, which falls in line with a lot of international standards, ONORM, DVGW, where they're targeting 40 millijoules. So again, you're just opening that window a little bit more, creating a greater umbrella of pathogens that you're going to be inactivating. So the components in a UV system are quite simple. Designing a UV system is incredibly complicated, but once you have it done, it's actually quite simple. It's very commonly referred to in our industry as a light in a pipe. I promise you it's a lot more complicated than putting a light in a pipe. But it really boils down to, let's call it 4 critical components. So you have an electronic driver, which is really driving your lamp and allowing the system to function the way it needs to. There's a lot of sort of current requirements that exist around how to drive the lamp efficiently. You have your UV reactor, obviously, where water passes through. That's important in how we calculate RED and make sure we have good dose distribution. We have a quartz surface which protects the lamp from water, but is also able to transmit light through it. I'll explain that again at the end of the day. And that really, at its core, is a UV system. Not overly complicated, which is nice in this world, because technical capacity, especially at the private homeowner level, is when it comes to water treatment equipment, I should say, not to insult anybody who owns a private well, but can be challenging, right? So maintaining and simple, effective technologies are a benefit. So the lamp, at the end of the day, is really the heart of a UV system. This is what's providing disinfection. If this is not of sound quality and robust, we're really not, at the end of the day, going to do what we want to do. And there's a large variety of lamps that exist in the world. The main ones we see in residential, sort of light commercial, are low-pressure standard output lamps. Again, all these are mercury vapor, but we have low-pressure high-output lamps, and then we have low-pressure high-output amalgam lamps. low pressure lamps are a step above the originals, which are soft glass lamps, but still a fairly old technology at this point. They're still very commonly used, but fairly old. There's nothing wrong with them, but we tend to see a shift in the industry where we're moving to more high output technologies. The main difference between all of these things is really power density. So how much UVC energy can you get out of a small lamp envelope? So if you're to consider these three things side by side, let's just say the lamp is a 30-watt lamp. A 30-watt standard output lamp is probably around, I don't know, 2.5, 3 feet long, so it's a fairly long lamp. A low-pressure, high-output lamp would be about half that size, delivering the same amount of UVC output, and a low-pressure, high-output amalgam lamp would be about half of that, again, delivering the same amount of output. So as UV advances, we're not so much deviating from how we generate light in a sense of mercury vapor, but we're able to get a lot more bang in a very, very small footprint, which is beneficial, especially in the residential treatment industry, where space is really not something that you always have a luxury. You don't always have that luxury. Right? You don't always have a giant mechanical room that was designed specifically for you to put treatment in. So. The sleeve really is a protection type component within a UV system. The sleeve's primary purpose is really to just, like I say, protect that lamp from the water. But the sleeve is also very important in that it needs to allow light to pass through it. So UVC light doesn't pass through everything freely as like visible light maybe. So if we were to simply just use glass, we would probably have very, very poor disinfection because the UVC light is just really not passing through that material very well. So we use fused quartz silica, and fused quartz silica generally has around an 89 to 93% transmittance. So if we're sending kind of 100 photons out, this is how many are going to get through that and into the water. So it's a very strong material. It's very easy to reproduce, has a very, very good transmittance, and allows us to maximize disinfection as best we possibly can. The controller, I would call the brain. So the controller is really what's driving the lamp at an optimal level. So running a UV lamp is not as simple as flicking on a light switch. I wish it were, but unfortunately it's not. So what a controller has to do really is generate an arc across a lamp, which is a high voltage strike. It needs to run a lamp at a very specific current to maximize output, but it also needs to manage voltage at the lamp as well. So in the residential world, again, consistent and high quality power is not always something that we have a luxury of as well. So a UV ballast has to be able to accept varying currents that are coming in and maintain a constant output to the lamp. If we don't do that, when power goes up and down like it's been doing in here all morning, the lamp is doing the same thing, right? The lamp will be doing the same thing, and that's going to compromise disinfection at the end of the day. So chamber design, which is oddly enough the whole pipe component of a UV system, is surprisingly critical when it comes to UV systems design. Generally, these are made out of stainless steel, and for those of you that come across residential systems, you'll probably see a fairly wide range of chamber designs that exist in the world. I'll be the first person to say that as far as lights and pipes are concerned, there are very bad chamber designs and there are very, very good chamber designs. The most efficient chamber design that exists in the UV world is an axial flow, which is furthest to the right in the top right corner. And the reason why chamber design is so very important is you have to appreciate that as light shines out into the water that's closest to the lamp sees the highest intensity. The water that's furthest away from the lamp sees the lowest intensity. And water in itself has an infinite number of paths that it can follow through that reactor. So from a chamber design, we need to make water move as consistently as we can across the lamp so that we can have what we call a good average dose. So we need a good, normally distributed dose across that reactor, and we can average it out. We need to understand how much of the water is going to pass through a low dose path at a fast speed, and how much is going to, or at a slow speed, and how much is going to pass through a high intensity path at a low speed, or reverse. I'm confusing myself, but At the end of the day, if you do not design a reactor appropriately, if you do not invest the energy in CFD modeling and things of this nature and challenge testing, you run the risk of short circuiting. You run the risk of significant amounts of water running past a UV lamp in a low dose path, and you're not going to get good inactivation. You just have a very, very inefficient reactor. And we need to also balance that with that whole space component. So most efficient and easiest to install is forever a balance. But at the end of the day, as long as you're challenging those things and doing the right CFD modeling to show how fluid is moving through them, these pipes are very, very important. So along with CFD modeling and dose distribution, we need to consider the flow rate through those reactors as well and how that impacts dose. So because dose through that reactor is a component of both intensity and time, flow being that time component, we need to be very, very careful how we're managing that. So dose is not a line in the sand. It changes. Every time the flow rate changes by a gallon a minute, that dose being delivered is going to change as well. So we need to make sure that we're managing those appropriately as well, in that very, very high flow rates through a reactor will deliver a low dose, and very, very slow flow rates through a reactor will deliver a very, very high dose. So. Oh, sorry. I should also comment that from a residential side, one of the best things that we can do from a design component is when we design a reactor, we say, or when we implement a reactor in a home, we're going to say, this UV reactor is going to do this flow rate, this dose, and we need to make sure that we can't exceed that. So that's why we use things like flow controls in UV reactors and when we're using them in the field. Because that way, regardless of the pump and all these other things that are occurring up front, we're making sure that to the homeowner, the flow control is in place. We will never deliver a flow that's beyond what we said that, or what we designed this system to do. So the implementation of UV in the field relies, its ability to be effective is so reliant on water quality. And earlier in this presentation, I explained that UV is just a piece of the puzzle. UV is not, in any capacity, a silver bullet. There's no silver bullets in water treatment. That's the first thing that we need to recognize as an industry. And I think with WQA, they do a phenomenal job at educating and making sure people understand these things. But UV, even specifically, is a line of sight technology, which means the better the water quality, the more light we're going to get into the water, the better disinfection our disinfection objective is going to be achieved when we do that. And there's various water quality parameters that exist, or contaminants that exist, that are going to negatively impact the performance of a UV system. So our objective at the end of the day is to have water at a point where we're letting the maximum amount of light get into the water. And that starts with probably one of our most common contaminants, which is total hardness in water, which is really just a combination of calcium, magnesium, in some instances iron is a hardness ion. But how that negatively impacts a quart or a UV system is on that quartz surface. We talked about how quartz surfaces need to have high transmittance. They need to let a lot of light get out. Well, much like it'll occur in your shower, in your dishwasher, in your hot water tank, calcium is going to start to foul on a quartz sleeve. It's going to start to generate a scale because lamps are generating some heat. As we generate scale across a quartz sleeve, less light is going to get out into the water. So we're going to compromise disinfection by having fouled surfaces. Generally, when we're doing design, we use aging and fouling factors, so we try our best to assume that there's going to be some fouling that occurs, but given the water quality, it can happen a lot more rapidly than you care to admit. So that hardness develops, we can't allow light to get out, and ultimately we are at that point just a light in a pipe. we're just wasting electricity at that point. So making sure that we understand scale forming contaminants that exist in water is critical to having a UV system do exactly what you want it to do. Turbidity is another big one, commenting or touching on the question that was asked in Tanya's presentation. Putting a 5-micron filter, putting some sort of physical filtration in front of a UV system is super, super critical. And I can appreciate that hydraulically it may have some issues with pressure and plugging and service and maintenance and these things. It's important because these physical particles, again, UV is a line of sight technology. It's important because if microorganisms or potential pathogens are in the shadows of those particles as it floats by, we're not going to be able to inactivate them because no light is actually touching them. The other risk that exists there is if the particles are large enough and pathogens get inside of them, then they're just going to float right by and we're going to have no disinfection whatsoever. So ensuring that we have good filtration, we're filtering water down to about 1 NTU or so is a really, really good practice. 5 minutes. I'm going to have to bang through this quick. Tannins is the other one. Tannins basically dissolved organics in water. They have a direct impact on transmittance, so the light, again, just physically can't penetrate out into the water, and for that reason, you're really impacting your dose distribution at that point. You may have some disinfection close to the lamp, but outside of the lamp or on the outer walls of the reactor, you're not going to be getting any disinfection. This can be overcome by reducing UVT, but it's important to understand the dissolved organics in water. And that really translates into the most important value that exists in sizing UV reactor, and probably the most under-tested area analytically in water as far as UV is concerned is ultraviolet transmittance. So ultraviolet transmittance, much like the sleeve, is a measurement of if we shine light into the water, how much is actually getting through. It's a very, very simple test that we run. We basically compare, we use DI water as a 0. We say if we shine 100 UV photons in here, 100 are coming out. We compare our sample to that. And that helps us understand how much light is going to get out. Ultraviolet transmittance has an absolutely massive impact on UV dose. So a 10% reduction in ultraviolet transmittance is equivalent to about a 25% reduction in UV dose. So very, very small changes in water quality have very, very significant impacts on the amount of UV energy that's getting out into the water. So we need to make sure that we understand these things so that we can size properly. And how we size properly is in lower UVT waters, we just reduce the flow to compensate for losses that we're seeing in UV light. So again, it's that inverse relationship between dose and flow. So lower the flow, the higher the dose. So if we reduce our flow technically by 25%, we're gonna combat that loss in UVT. Real quick, we talked a lot about this, keys to installation success, so make sure we're choosing the right UV system, make sure we understand these water quality parameters and how they impact the UV reactor and the disinfection process. There's lots of tools out there that'll help guide not only yourselves but customers in choosing the right system. We need to make sure that we have proper pretreatment, and maintenance is super, super important. Make sure that quartz surfaces are clean, make sure that lamps are changed annually. Don't ever rely on a blue glow of a light. I told you, or as we explained earlier, UVC is an invisible spectrum of light. We can't see it, but UV lamps will glow blue forever. I can't count how many times I've had someone call me and say, well, I haven't changed my lamp in 10 years because it's still glowing blue. Well, again, just really enforcing that light in a pipe conversation, unfortunately. But maintenance is super, super critical. So even when you're doing inspections or working with homeowners, make sure that they understand that lamp UVC does degrade and it needs to be changed. Quartz surfaces, again, they'll solarize and they'll foul over time. So the UVT of that material will degrade over time, and they need to be changed periodically as well. But at the end of the day, as much as I may have made that complicated, UV is a very, very simple and phenomenal technology that exists in water treatment. It's a real benefit to public health. It's a real benefit to the overall treatment train that we're going to put in a residential application, specifically for addressing the risks of potential pathogens as they exist in water. So 1 minute, 30 seconds to spare.
Questions? I need to use this because I realize those guys told me that it doesn't show up on the video if I don't use a mic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so. Okay, so the first one we have is what maintenance is required for UV systems? How often do the lamps and quartz sleeves have to be replaced?
Yeah, so lamps, as we talked about, is about a 9,000 hour degradation to about 80%. So one of the common misunderstandings is as soon as it hits 365, you need to rip that thing out and change it, or the world is over. You know, nothing good is going to come from this. It's really not what's going to happen. When we calculate degradation and when you put the specs out for a UV system, you're talking about the end of lamp life. So on the 365th day, that's when we're delivering the spec that we said. So it's a very, very conservative process. It's a very, very safe process. But once we go beyond that point, we're not delivering the UV doses that we said we were going to deliver anymore. And that becomes a bit of a compliance issue, I guess you could say, right? We can't guarantee to the homeowner that they're getting the disinfection that they're saying they're going to get. And quart sleeves is tough. It's really relying on water quality. The more organics you have in the water, the quicker these things are going to foul to a point where you can't get them clean again. I generally advise, given the cost of a sleeve, just change it every 2 years, and it's better safe than sorry.
Okay, so the second question here, the gist of that is UV leaves the bacteria alive. So if you test after that, you might have a positive hit.
So if you're doing P&A and you had a very significant concentration, you might, but those tests require organisms to reproduce in a very specific environment. So if they're unable to reproduce, then you're not going to get a cultured positive result. It's a whole live dead conversation, right? Depends on which test you're doing. You could do tests that show that it's still there, but the question is not whether it's there or not, it's whether it's viable. Can it actually infect? And the answer to that question would be no.
And the third one I think you've already answered. Certainly the UV should be last, and if you have calcium and magnesium, you're going to probably have a softener, right?
Yeah, so as far as fouling is concerned, it's tough to say. I generally use the standards or the recommendations that WQA and CWQA and NSF use, which is about 7 grains of hardness, 0.3 iron, 0.05 manganese, and then tannins around 0.1, turbidity around 1 NTU. But really it boils down to how often you use it. The longer you let it sit, the more fouling you're going to get. Precipitation of minerals is going to be accelerated when there's high temperatures involved, so it's just better to just soften it if you can, but maintenance will help you overcome that. So,
And I think that's all we have time for.
Perfect.
So we'll get to the other questions later. And thank you.
My pleasure.
All right.